Jesus Christ, seen in one of the many film interpretations of his life. Said historian Will Durant, "The life, character and teaching of Christ constitute the most fascinating feature in the history of Western man." That story comes from what we know as the New Testament. The New Testament came some 400 years after the Old Testament, but the New is deeply rooted in the Old. The earliest Christian church didn't have a Bible of its own. Its Bible was the Old Testament. But even as the Christian scriptures were being composed, they referred repeatedly to the Hebrew scriptures. These references include 58 of the 66 Old Testament books. Jesus was a Jew. His first followers were mostly Jews. They were steeped in the Old Testament and believed Jesus was the fulfillment of God's promises to his people in the ancient scriptures. These included predictions given centuries earlier, now seen as fulfilled in Jesus. In fact, there were over 50 such predictions, including he would be born in Bethlehem, born of a virgin, he would cure the deaf and the blind. He would be betrayed by a friend, sold for 30 pieces of silver. He would be killed amidst criminals. But while the two testaments are closely linked, there are also major differences between them. The Old Testament was written over at least a 1,000-year period. The New Testament was written in a period of 50 to 70 years. The Old Testament was written in the Hebrew language. The New Testament was written in Greek. The Old Testament is about 3 times as long as the New Testament. The Old Testament concentrates primarily on a people, Israel. The New Testament centers mainly on a person, the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. There are 4 main sections in the New Testament. First, there are 4 Gospels, or narrations about Jesus. There is a history of the early church called the Book of Acts. Then we get to read other people's mail in the form of 21 letters or epistles, most of which were written by leaders to address problems in the young churches. The last book, Revelation or the Apocalypse, shows how God in Christ will consummate history, judge all peoples and nations, and bring forth a new heaven and a new earth. After Jesus left them, the earliest Christians often met and worshipped in synagogues, but after the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, when the Christians did not fight alongside fellow Jews against the Romans, Christians and the Jews went their separate ways. The Christians usually met in homes, and in addition to their Old Testament scriptures, they told the stories of Jesus from reports given by the apostles of Jesus. But the church was spreading like a wildfire in the Roman Empire, through Asia Minor, Eastern Europe, North Africa, even to the center of power in Rome. As the word spread, reliable first-hand witness reports about Jesus were needed that could be copied and shared from place to place. The need for the Gospels also became evident when the church realized that although the Lord might return in the clouds at any moment, that they really didn't know how long it would be before he returned. So they needed trustworthy accounts of Jesus' life and words. So among the various accounts circulating, 4 were approved for use in the churches. But why 4 Gospels? And can they be the actual words of Jesus, since they were written years after he spoke them? There were 4 different Gospels because the 4 authors wrote with different purposes and recipients in mind. It seems that Matthew concentrated on addressing Jewish concerns. Mark is a briefer, fast-action Gospel. Luke, a Gentile doctor, wrote more for the Greek mind. And John, the last to write, goes into more personal and theological reflection than the others. So they offer views of Jesus from 4 different angles, rather like a televised game where different cameras cover the same game and plays, but offer a variety of different angles or perspectives. But do we really have Jesus' very own words? Jesus never left us a written account of his teachings. That came from his closest followers. Could they accurately remember so much that he said over the 3-year period that they spent together? In an oral culture, why wouldn't the words of Jesus be remembered in detail? If there's one thing that we can say for sure about Jesus' words, it is that they were memorable. His words stopped people in their tracks. No one ever spoke the way that this man does, was the conclusion of the temple guards. His style of storytelling and his cryptic summary observations would indeed be hard to forget. Professor Rainer Reisner at the University of Tübingen in Germany notes the remarkable capacity for memorization among Jesus' people.
Copies of Old Testament books were very expensive in New Testament times. Only very rich people could buy them. For the ordinary people, the books of the Old Testament were found only in the synagogues. So if someone liked to practice the Old Testament in daily life, he had to learn passages of the Old Testament by heart. The first followers of Jesus were pious Jews. They were used to memorize large portions of text. Jesus himself acted as a Jewish teacher, and this meant that he summarized important points of his teaching in short, very well formulated, memorizable sentences. These sentences he could also formulate with poetic devices, for example in parallelisms. To give one example, Jesus said, "For whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." This sentence can be memorized after one hearing. But most of his teaching summaries Jesus repeated at different occasions and in front of different audiences. So those disciples accompanying him all the time could hear these teaching summaries and memorize them very well.
Even in our own day, some consider it not a great feat to commit a whole gospel to memory.
And he began again to teach by the seaside.
Actor Alec McCowan held audiences spellbound in his one-man stage play that consisted of nothing more than a recitation of the Gospel of Mark. He goes on for a couple of hours. Word for word, the entire Gospel is recalled and repeated.
And said unto them in his doctrine, hearken. Behold, there went out a sower to sow, And it came to pass, as he sowed, some fell by the wayside, and the fowls of the air came and devoured it up. And some fell on stony ground where it had not much earth, and immediately it sprang up, because it had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, it was scorched, and because it had no root, it withered away.
And we might also consider that Matthew, one of Jesus' closest followers, probably would have known a form of shorthand.
Matthew probably knew shorthand. There are several reasons for this statement, for this assessment of the situation. He was, as we know, a civil servant, a tax collecting official in Upper Galilee. And in this position, a certain degree of shorthand writing was absolutely obligatory. Now, we also know from contemporary evidence, parchments and other indications from historical writings, that shorthand writing was a known technique among Jews and Greek-speaking Jews and Romans of that period.
The rest of the New Testament consists largely of letters, in some cases written or dictated while the writer was in prison for his faith, as often happened to the Apostle Paul. These letters typically grew out of crises or problems faced by the young churches. Let's take just one example. The ancient city of Corinth, Greece, is located between two seas. It drew many travelers and was notorious for its sensuality and commercialized sex. The Apostle Paul planted a church there with some Jews and mostly Gentiles. As they struggled to grow in the faith, they experienced all kinds of problems. They were acting selfishly and thoughtlessly toward one another. There was bitter internal strife. Some held on to old pagan practices. Others were full of religious pride. There was sexual immorality, including incest. It was a mess. But it prompted from Paul words regarded by many as maybe the most beautiful and magnificent ever written. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always perseveres. Love never fails. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Now, we see but a poor reflection, as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now, I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now, these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. The New Testament books were all handwritten. There were no printing presses then, so all copies were made by hand. some on parchment or animal skins, but most on a material called papyrus. The rich waters of the Nile. Its annual flooding provides nourishment for the agriculture of Egypt. The Nile was also home to the remarkable papyrus plant. Papyrus is a reed plant that grows on the banks of the Nile, usually from 6 to 12 feet high, and it can be as thick as a man's wrist. Ancient Egyptians regarded it as a sacred plant that they worshipped. They used part of the plant for food. The stalk was also used to make cords, string, mattresses, even cloth for wrapping mummies or making sails. They were even bundled together to make small boats. To make papyrus, the pith of the plant was cut into sections and then overlapped into vertical and horizontal strips. It was moistened and pressed together and then smoothed off and made into sheets. This is a piece of papyrus. If you look closely, you can see the different strips crossed over each other. Now for us, paper is cheap. Just look how much you get in a Sunday newspaper. But in the ancient world, papyrus was precious. A single sheet could cost the equivalent of 2 days' wages for a typical labourer. Now, as the quantity of New Testament writings grew, many sheets would be gathered together. Then they would be folded in half and then stitched together. This was called a codex. It was an early stage of the modern book. The various documents of the New Testament were copied and circulated to churches near and far.
Now, the canon is a list of those books that the early church regarded as authoritative Word of God. So there was a necessity to sift among the various other books, which Luke says were already being written by Christians, in order to determine which books are the authoritative works that belong to the New Testament. What were those criteria by which that sifting occurred? First, the early church chose those books that were written by apostles or by associates of apostles. Mark and Luke were not among the 12, but were associated, Mark with Peter, Luke with the apostle Paul. Secondly, another criterion was how far a given book was harmonizing and altogether in agreement with the other books that had already been in wide use in the church. And the third had to do with the way in which that understanding of the work of Christ formed what was called in Latin the regula fidei, the rule of faith. Now, this took many generations because, first of all, the 27 books of the New Testament were written in quite different places in the ancient world by different people at different times. Probably the first part of the New Testament that we have was the first epistle of Paul to the Thessalonians. Well, someone had to find these books, collect them, bring them together, and be assured that they were authoritative books. So this, very briefly, in a nutshell, is what we think happened about the collecting of the books of the New Testament. Church synods, church councils took place. They ratified what already had been the judgment of Christian believers, high and low alike, as to what books were in the New Testament. So I've been accustomed in my teaching to say the New Testament is a collection of authoritative books. It's not an authoritative collection of books. It did not become authoritative because a group in a church council decided these should be in the New Testament. The books were authoritative as soon as they were written.
The churches have always disagreed on many things, but they just about unanimously agree on which books made up the New Testament. But how close are the copies we have today to the ancient scriptures as they were originally written now almost 2,000 years ago? For as you'd expect, we don't have any of the originals of any of the New Testament books. Scholars carefully analyze ancient manuscripts to evaluate the quality of textual transmission. For most classical literature, the evidence is not always abundant. Here are some of the most famous works, the approximate time they were written, the year of the earliest manuscript that is available, the length of time between the original writing and the first available copy, and the number of manuscripts that are available to compare. Now look at the unparalleled wealth of biblical texts, both in quantity and closeness to the original. There are fragments of New Testament books that scholars agree go back as early as the year 125 AD. And recently, there have been some startling claims by Dr. Carsten Tiede in Germany that are attracting wide attention, that some papyrus fragments can be dated as early as the lifetime of the apostles of Jesus.
We know that among the 100 known papyri of the New Testament, there are some that belong to the 1st or early 2nd century. Two of them are particularly important. One is a scroll fragment found at Qumran, giving us 2 verses from chapter 6 of Mark's Gospel. The other one is a codex fragment belonging to chapter 26 of Matthew's Gospel, bought in Luxor in Upper Egypt, now at a college in Oxford. Now these two, both datable to the 60s of the 1st century or thereabouts, are not only proof of 1st century sources of the written New Testament compared to an oral tradition, they also show us that there was a transition from the scroll, the classical, ancient format used by Jews and the Romans and the Greeks and so forth, and the codex, the new practical book-like format, almost invented by Christians, made popular by Christians. And we can now show that this happened before and at the time when the first community lived and worked and preached in Jerusalem around the year 70 AD. And that is very important, not least because it helps us to understand that written sources, written documents existed at a period when eyewitnesses, apostles, disciples were still alive.
Dr. Tiede's position is being fiercely debated and probably will be for some time. But what is beyond dispute is the cumulative evidence for the reliability of the New Testament text. As we saw with the Old Testament, the New Testament too is rooted in history. Real people experiencing real life at specific times and places. Places you can still visit today and find many of them remarkably unchanged from biblical times. The Mount of Temptation, where Jesus struggled against Satan for 40 days. The Sea of Galilee, where Jesus called fishermen to be his followers, and where fishermen today still cast their nets. Bethany near Jerusalem, where Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead and stayed with friends before he was arrested. The Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus agonized in prayer to God. It is said that some of these trees date back 2,000 years to Jesus' time. Dominus Flavet, the Lord wept, a church in the shape of a teardrop, reminds how Jesus from this place wept over the city of Jerusalem. The New Testament, written in the relatively small Mediterranean world, soon crossed the waters to every continent. This same New Testament, used for centuries, is still recited and remembered every week in Christian churches throughout the world now some 2,000 years later. No other book has been as widely read in all of history. Today, it's still the most read book in the most languages throughout the world. The accounts may be ancient, but their ability to grip the heart, stir the imagination, and change lives still exerts a lasting power in the lives of believers.